So thank you very much for joining us. We've got Lisa Oswald from Goethe University of Frankfurt. She's professor for computational social sciences. Her research focuses on public discourse in online environments and the role of digital media for democratic politics. She holds a PhD in political science from the Hertie School in Berlin and has recent publications in Science Advances and Nature and Human Behavior. So very pleased that you could join us. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Let me just quickly share my screen. Here we go. Okay, can you all see my screen? Does that work?
Yep, perfect.
Fantastic. Yeah, so thanks again very much for the invitation. Very happy to be here. And today I will be talking or presenting very much or I will focus on one specific project, a recent field study that I ran on Reddit. I will try to make it a bit more broad and study, or like talk about more generally how to study silence on social media and how to study groups. And I think another title for this talk could have been how methodological challenges translate into substantive knowledge gaps, and yeah, maybe also what we could do about this. Maybe just to start very, very broadly, what we study, and with we, I mean like the maybe computational social science community more broadly, we oftentimes collect social media data, sometimes also look at parliamentary speeches, video transcripts, so a lot of digital trace data. And we analyze the content. Yeah, don't get me wrong, we have a lot of very sophisticated methods to do this. But generally, when we think about what we learn from this, is we learn a lot about what people produce. However, when you actually look at empirical data of how we call this the production consumption gap actually looks like, most people, especially when you look at political social media use, really passively consume or view political content online, and just a small minority actually actively produces the vast majority of content. Yeah, this basically leads me to the question of what we may miss in quantitative description of digital traces. And in a recent, I would say more perspective paper that is still on the OSF, we discussed this issue. We conceptualized basically online political activity as the shape of an iceberg with like the active and visible producers just at the very tip, and the majority of consumers, also maybe including some occasional commenters and also clear lurkers at the bottom under the surface, basically. And unfortunately, different research projects point to the fact that the invisible versus the visible are not the same people, and they are systematically different from one another. So when you actually look at predictors for content consumption, you usually very stably see political interest as predictor. And when you look at the characteristics of those who produce content, you, on top of political interest, also see that those tend to be men rather, and people with in tendency higher comment toxicity and also stronger opinion strength. So basically, this is the group of people that we capture when we look at social media data. Right. I'm pretty sure that many of you know this, what is your estimate paper? And I found it so interesting to see that already this paper had a really, really clear statement that basically, when we just look at a slice of the world, we can get really counterintuitive results. The authors here also state that issues of sample selection may really grow in importance as sociology or maybe also other social sciences explore new data sources, which is very much what we do in CSS. And in our perspective paper, we just labeled this or categorized this as a challenge. We have an over-representation of active users in social media data, the tip of the iceberg, as I described. And as a consequence, we propose the adoption of user-centered data collection. So what do I mean with this? So social media data usually follows a platform-centric data collection approach. And when you think about what kind of data you actually have to collect to see content consumption and not production, this could, for example, be web tracking data such as browser histories. However, also here, one key ingredient is still missing, and that is a sampling process. And usually that starts with, for example, the collection of survey data from a panel where you make an explicit sampling decision. So basically, one example of user-centered data collection could be you sample participants, maybe even a nationally representative sample, lead them to a survey, and then go down into the digital traces and not start from the other side. Another challenge that we see is even when you have this user-centered data collection or even experiments, is that social media activity, so this production versus consumption gap, may actually co-vary with online study compliance, right? So people who are a lot online, who write a lot online, may also be those who are able to, for example, donate their data. So here we would say definitely a consequence is that we should try to reduce and absolutely minimize friction in study participation, and of course then systematically examine and report differential study compliance and nutrition. I would say actually basics, but still we wanted to highlight that in the context of digital trace data. So that was all not really about experiments, but still about yeah, the quantitative description. But even with experiments, there's just one last bad note that I want to make before I jump into my experiment. And that is with experiments, we also miss a fundamental feature of social media, because usually we just randomly assign treatments on an individual level. But social media is really fundamentally or like a prime example of complex systems. And social networks come with really specific properties that also can challenge traditional statistics. And when you think about experiments, that can be, for example, the Sutwa assumption. So the assumption that an individual's outcome under treatment should only depend on their own treatment status and not on the treatment status of others, right? So, and now the question is, okay, so what if we would study groups? What if we actually would take into account the social nature of social media? What if we actually do consider the silent, do this under informed consent, and do this in a real world environment? Then we get to our experiment that does not solve all problems, but try to help with a bit. And that is basically the study why I was invited here happily. And in this study, we try to disentangle participation in online political discussions with a collective field experiment. So I think I already said quite a bit about why we were motivated about this, but maybe just to start very broadly, the collective field experiment was run on Reddit, and we wanted to examine the factors predicting self-selection into silent lurker or active, especially the power user roles. And we also wanted to experimentally test whether participation inequality can be reduced with different forms of interventions, because we actually had experimental control over discussion environments. And to lay out the theoretical process, or like the selection process that we just observe in this iceberg, I would start with a general internet user population. And then, of course, only those who have political interest would ever consume political content if you take out incidental exposure from this equation. But then, of course, among that subpopulation, only those with a motivation to express political views would ever become a producer of political content online. But it also seems like there is still a bit of a gap between motivation and behavior. And that could, for example, be something like a filtering step, that people also consider their perception of discourse toxicity. And maybe they also consider their perceptions of opinion distribution. So whether they are in a minority or in a majority opinion. So, and basically, here are the two steps of this selection pipeline where our experimental treatments try to affect outcomes. First, we had a moderation treatment. I would rather label it now as like a norm treatment, a civility norm treatment. So we basically try to reduce the barrier of discourse toxicity or perceived discourse toxicity through a norm intervention. And the other treatment group was an incentives treatment. So we just artificially tried to increase the motivation to express political views by paying participants to participate. Okay, and that is our study design. So we had a panel survey layer. We recruited people within Reddit using Reddit ads. I will also say a few more words about that later. We had a pre-survey, we had a post-survey. Those were quite extensive in like political attitudes, demographics, of course, all that stuff, informed consent, of course. And then based on this pre-treatment survey, we randomly assigned people into one of those groups, the moderation group, the incentives group, or the control group. Based on the pre-survey, so it was a perfect random assignment. We did not use any quotas, but we had a pretty extensive manual onboarding step where we really checked whether people actually had valid Reddit accounts, had complete surveys, had all the data presented that we need for the field experiment. Right. And then also, additionally to the pre and the post survey, we had weekly check-in surveys where we asked people about their perceptions of the group and perceptions about the political issues that were discussed. And so in every week, people discussed 5 different political issues, and the order and everything was randomized, also the timing. And that is, I'm not sure if I said this, but this is a US sample. Right. So that was the interface. I'm sure you all know how a subreddit looks like, but that was one of the 6. Oh yeah, here I didn't actually say this, but we had 2 different subreddits for each experimental condition. We actually just did this mostly as a backup because we had real interactions among real people, and of course we were in a sense responsible for what was going on in those subreddits, and we just had no clue whether maybe in one subreddit one person would, I don't know, start posting illegal content, and we could have been forced to shut one of the 2 down. So we had it as a backup in a sense. This actually did never happen. And so we had 2 observations on the group level, which was nice, but still not much. We had the surveys and the check-in surveys following the first survey always just implemented within the subreddit. So people could, in principle, never leave the subreddit to be part of the experiment and to comply with everything that we wanted them to do after the first survey. These are just examples of the discussion issues. They were always labeled as daily discussion issue. And it was just, as it was implemented on Reddit, it was just the regular interface. That was the Reddit advertisement campaign that we ran. We really wanted to recruit people in their natural habitat to actually have a field experiment. And if you remember what I said in the beginning, right, we wanted to really reduce switching costs and increase compliance. And this is why we did not take for example, nationally representative sample from a panel provider, but we really wanted to have people who are regular Reddit users. I would say there are definitely like pros and cons in both approaches. It was relatively cost effective as well. And in principle, if you think about doing this, you also have the option for targeting as you have in all social media recruitment campaigns, but we did not use this in this study. Right. On the onboarding procedure, I'm not sure if this is so interesting, but I would say one point that is still interesting in this experiment is that there was a lot of manual effort actually involved. So we communicated pretty directly with participants. So speaking about the user management, we used the classic Reddit mod mail, the moderator mail. When we wanted to reach everybody, we posted to the subreddit, and only occasionally we used direct messages via the Reddit API as automated form of communication. And our hypothesis is that this manual communication with participants about questions, as this went for 4 weeks, really increased study compliance. Right. Speaking about completion, we had no differential attrition across experimental conditions, 30% dropout in each stage, I would say. This is how the treatment looked like. I would say in the end, this experiment can more or less be reduced to information treatments, which we provided in the onboarding survey, in the welcome messages that people received on Reddit when they were admitted to the subreddits, as welcome posts in the sidebar, and we even had a wiki. So that was really like the information was always presented and different across the different conditions. In the moderation condition, we had always these statements like, please be civil, respectful, and on-topic, blah, blah, blah. And in the incentives condition, it was also really clear that people receive extra $2 for every day on which they participate. Okay, and we had a sort of combined or stacked treatment in the moderation condition because we were the moderators of the subreddits. We could also adjust the settings. In the safety settings of the subreddits, you could change the spam filter strength and different other automated measures. We changed them only in the moderation condition. But I have to say, I'm not sure if I would do this again because you don't really, it's quite opaque because you don't really know whether these measures actually make a difference, whether there is any automated moderation. We suspect that this actually did not even happen because the toxicity was overall very low and there was no spamming in the subreddits. So people were actually really good participants. So it was a bit difficult to disentangle. But of course, if you just change these as isolated experimental factors, that could also be super interesting. But as a stacked treatment, it's a bit opaque. Topics were scheduled, and now onto the results. So here, of course, as this was advertised as discussion experiment, and also we have the incentives condition here. These are just descriptors for the entire sample. You see that, of course, the active group in our experiment is much larger than usual. But we do have silent people, and those are people who replied to our check-in and follow-up surveys, but did never write a single comment. To do the check-in surveys, they must visit the subreddit, basically. And the join-only participants are those that we disregard in the next analysis because they also did never write a comment, but they also never replied to any of the follow-up surveys. So we can not say whether they are actually just non-compliers with the study or just whatever, forgot about the experiment and never visited the subreddit. But with those that we label as silent, we can be really certain that they at least sometimes visited the subreddit. And of course, like with the number of comments written, you see just like the normal distribution of how communication happens online. Very few people writing much, most people writing not so much. Right, and now on to descriptive predictors of user-level discussion participation. And here we used zero-hurdle models to separately model the silent versus the active and the less active versus the more active. So basically in the count model, we do not have the silent. Right, and when you want to understand or when you want to see what characterizes power users or the more active, you can see really clearly aligning with existing literature. Those are rather male. They are those who also self-report that they frequently comment online, and those with the highest political interest. When you look at their perceptions of the discussion environment, though, it was pretty interesting to see that compared to those who write little, those who write a lot, they say that the group is not knowledgeable. They think that the group is pretty polarized and that the discussions are toxic. So they have a pretty negative perception of the entire discussion climate. And this also holds when you residualize the toxicity perceptions with the objective measure of discussion toxicity from the comment text. So, and when you look at the lurkers, so the silent, I would say the demographics are not that interesting, but when you look at the perceptions of the discussion environment, these predictors actually look completely flipped to those of the power users, right? So people only overcome this zero hurdle or like step out of their silence when they perceive the group as respectful and knowledgeable and the discussions as enjoyable and constructive. Okay, and now we're actually in the experiment and looking at participation. It was really interesting to see that this pattern of participation inequality was really, really stubborn, and even we thought pretty strong incentives really plainly paying people to participate did change or like statistically significantly changed the participation inequality. So you see like the Gini coefficient went down, but still there is still quite strong participation inequality. The moderation condition didn't change anything here. And interestingly, this is again descriptive evidence. So basically, because here we looked at what happens between, or the experimental treatment just happened between groups, but we also were interested in what happens within groups over time. And you could see that social feedback was pretty strong or correlated like the scores that people received or the votes that people received on their previous comments were positively associated with the number of next day comments and also the propensity to comment again. And you could actually see a pretty clear discontinuity. I mean, this is just like eyeballing this here, but the discontinuity at the start value of 1, basically, because if nobody votes, a comment has a score of 1, not 0, and then if the score goes up, you can see that also the number of next day comments actually increases. Those were all effects on participation or things looking at participation. And now looking at effects on discourse or toxicity, for example, you could see that, basically almost all of the 20 political issues that were discussed in those subreddits were discussed pretty constructively. Experimental treatment effects on comment toxicity and comment length could not be found. And that was also interesting because in the incentives condition, we were relatively certain that people would just satisfy and write something to just get the reward, but this actually did not happen. And then just as a methodological bit, we also wanted to look at the observer effects in our experiment. So for the participants in the subreddits or in the experimental subreddits, we also collected their external comment activity on Reddit, so their behavior in the wild, also under informed consent, and we could see that comment length and toxicity really corresponded quite nicely, but toxicity was slightly lower in our experiment and comments were slightly longer in our experiment. Effects on attitudes, so downstream effects were null, definitely, pretty clearly null. Of course, I would say it's not surprising because our theoretical argument of why this may have downstream consequences on attitudes was based on the assumption that there will be a difference in participation, which we did not really see strongly. However, we saw pretty strong differences in variables pre versus post treatment. So this is not experimentally, but the black coefficient plot is just pre-post differences. But I have to say that the presidential debate between Trump and Biden was basically a week before the post survey. So this is why I believe the trust measures are just like drastically declining. However, we see one very interesting pattern that we now look at in a follow-up study. Namely, we see a pretty strong decline in political interest pre versus post discussion. And we also see the same for political issue knowledge for almost all of the issues. And our hypothesis is that we had pretty deliberative discussions there. People were pretty engaged, and also many people writing long arguments. And based on this discussion experience, we imagine that people could have basically self-corrected their self-assessments of issue knowledge and also political interest, because being exposed to issue complexity and many other people who also know a lot about politics may just have showed them that they are not the smartest people in the room. Right. And now current work, this entire paper did not at all look at the comment text and the content of the comments. So this is, of course, the subject of the next project. Here we also look at private-public alignment on the issue level, what people think, what people express, and also on questions of when discussions continue and when they stop. So is this these are questions of, for example, argument saturation or conflict. And then we look at this concept. It's really like a working title, epistemic humility, what I said about the self-correcting in the social comparison. And then going forward, basically leaving the data from this experiment, I would love to do another field experiment looking that increases the number of groups. I think on Reddit, that's actually very difficult to scale. But I think there are very promising projects at the moment based on Mastodon. I would definitely like to continue studying silence online and perceptions and opinion dynamics among those that you usually cannot observe. And then final slide, maybe just zooming out again, some ways forward that I see based also on this study, but also more broadly. So I would say, especially in the computational social science community, I think we have to go really strong on basics again, or generally, really considering that total error comes from measurement and representation. And I think the way I introduce this talk really focuses also on the topic of representation, while I think measurement has received a lot of attention. I think we can go a bit stronger on the other one. I think it would be great if we would consider that social media is social and that people behave in groups, sometimes like a bit more in different research designs, even though this is really hard. And because this is so hard, I think it's important to triangulate methods where possible. And thinking really carefully about the usefulness of AI in political behavior research more broadly. I think in this experiment, for example, for tasks like data annotation, that is, of course, super useful now as we look at the full text. When we talk about task automation, so for example, the direct communication with participants, I personally think that it was a bit of a pain to do this manually, but I think it actually really helped the experiment. I'm actually originally a psychologist by training, and I think this like social interaction and like trust between people. And also sometimes this can be researchers and participants. I think it can make a difference for study compliance, for example. And in terms of silicon sampling, I think there are really interesting thoughts out there in this specific experiment. There was a great master student who basically replicated this entire study with LLMs instead of participants. But the knowledge, I think it was a very interesting and very like thoroughly conducted technical exercise. But I think the knowledge gain is really, really limited when you study things like participation, right? Because when you ask an LLM to state their opinion, it states something. It's like you cannot study silence with an LLM, right? So here you actually see a really clear example where you run into limitations of replacing human participants. All right, and that's it. And I'm very much looking forward to your questions.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Lisa. I'll just maybe stop recording.